Super. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Matthew Elefant. I'm with a company called Inclusive Digital, and really appreciate you guys waking up at 9 o'clock. We're all, I guess, virtually in Philadelphia, although missing the cheesesteaks. We're in listen-only mode right now. I'm going to go through some slides, but this is sort of meant to be an interactive presentation. So I'd ask you if you think of some questions, just write them down right now. And what we'll do is at moments, we'll sort of take a break and be able to answer those questions. And we'll certainly allot for time at the end to address any questions. As part of working within the disabled community, one of the things that I've used in the past, and although you can't see me, I myself do not have any sort of physical or auditory or visual disability, but I like to sort of carry on those best practices. So we do something called an accessibility check, and maybe Anton, this would be one time just to quickly unmute. I just want to make sure that the volume that I'm speaking is well, the speed of which I'm speaking is appropriate for everybody. I will be going through and describing images as we go through this. So if somebody on this presentation does have a visual disability, I'll try to verbalize those images as best I can. And as I said, this is something we'd like audience participation for. So please during those moments, please let me know any questions that you might have. So if we could just unmute just to get a verbal okay, or maybe just silence too, will let me know that we've sort of passed all these accessibility elements. Okay, I'm going to take the silence as a okay to go forward. And again, if there is something you'd like me to repeat, just let me know when we do get to those break moments, and we can go forward. Just so quickly about myself, my name, as I said in the beginning, is Matthew Elefant. It's a quick image of what I look like. Although I do usually have a better smirk than that. I don't know about that photo, but I've started, one of the founders of Inclusive Digital. We're based in New York City, but we have employees all over the country. We work with all sorts of different groups, a lot of agencies, direct customers, people that are building websites. And we primarily do four things for them. One is we do a lot of training. So we go into companies and talk about what accessibility is, how developers can start to think about accessibility when they're building projects, how UX and QA can start to build test cases for those elements. We sometimes elevate those elements and also work hand in hand with companies as they are developing stuff. So if you could imagine during like a sprint schedule, we would be a checkpoint within that element just to sort of check, audit, and validate how accessibility is being used. The third element is what we would call user testing, and this is when we actually have people that have native disabilities or are native to accessible technologies. And they do true usability testing. So one of the things we'll talk about when we get into some of the conversations around the law and the ADA, it's really about how do companies really validate that their applications meet accessible criteria. And one of the key things to do in this area is to actually have true user validation around that. And that's a service that we provide. And lastly is something we call accessibility monitoring, and that's automated testing. So we have a cloud-based platform that we monitor sites for various companies and report on a bi-weekly basis. I'm not going to do a demo of that software today, but if that's something of interest, you can please message me after this, and I'm happy to give anyone a demo. So just a quick overview of today. As I said, we'll get into some intros around disability rights. We'll talk about the law and language around that. We'll define the audience around disability testing. We'll talk about the accessive technologies that one will use. We'll talk about the WCAG standards associated with it. We'll talk about some of the various elements that you can start to incorporate within your daily development cycles or CMS elements around visual accessibility, formatting specific content for accessibility, guidelines around content accessibility for different websites, and then I'll share some of the resources that we have associated with it. So again, when we talk about experiencing inaccessibility or developing accessibility, we really try to bridge apart this element that creating a world that is accessible has benefits not just for people with disabilities, but really for everyone. And we can see this if you're walking the streets of Philadelphia or New York or taking, metro liners. So, the first picture is of somebody trying to cross the street and using a curb cut who's in a wheelchair. The second photo is somebody waiting on station platform with clear visual markings associated with that. And then the last bit is somebody who is using a braille keyboard associated with their computer. In the world of disability studies, these concepts are really sort of broken down into two models. The first is something called the medical model, which really sort of takes more of an introspective view of being disabled and really tries to look at how medicine or other elements can try to fix the disability within the person. Or then there's the latter model, which is what we would refer to as the social model, which is really how we can fix society so that we're creating more inclusivity for people with disabilities and areas of opportunity for participation for everyone. And in the middle of the screen, you see a photo of a woman in a wheelchair. All of these elements, especially from the social model, have led to what we would refer to as the Americans with Disabilities Act. And a lot of times when people talk about web accessibility, the ADA is in close comparison because so much of what is often discussed around web accessibility is the prevention of potential litigations if your website is not accessible. When we do think about that concept, it's really under the third element, which is Title III, places of public accommodation. And so when you think about Title III and Title III in your daily life, if you walk into a restaurant and within a restroom stall, you would see a handrail or braille on a doorway or in an elevator keypad. All of those rules are based underneath the ADA and the concept of Title III public accommodation. If you've been following case law and a lot of internet stories, basically Title III and our, which means basically that any website needs to be accessible underneath the guidelines of Title III. A lot of times there's a lot of confusion around the WCAG requirement, WCAG, a Web Content Access Guideline, and the relationship to Title III. And we'll sort of get into that conversation a little bit later on. But basically, one thing to keep in mind is, as you look to resolve ADA issues, the WCAG, the Web Content Access Guideline, is a method for solving and making sure that your site does become accessible for people with disabilities. And just to sort of put this in context for everybody, within the city of New York, and this is based on the most recent census guidelines, that 11% of all New Yorkers identify with some form of disability. And based on the World Health Organization, globally, between 15 and 20% of the world um, identifies with some form of disability. Anton, I would just say if there's a point to check in, if there's any questions, we could take a quick pause. If not, I'll go into the next section. Great. So when we think about designing for accessibility, I think it's really important that we start to think about creating definable audiences, that one can create use cases and test cases against, and really start to understand and explore how, by sort of creating these segments, we can really start to think about how to create world-class experiences for people with disabilities. So again, when we think about designing for people with disabilities, it's really underneath these main 4 criteria: eyes, ears, hands, and brain. And so if we take a segment and just sort of look at each one of them, we talk about eyes. Most people think, people who when we define this group, it's solely people that are blind, but really there is a whole nuance around blindness and degrees of blindness that we need to be prepared for. And so it's important to understand that people who have a visual disability might use not only a screen reader, but maybe a screen magnifier or some form of braille display, or might not have any sort of acuteness in terms of lack of vision, but might have color blindness. And so when we think about folks with visual disabilities, it's important to realize how those people might be using our web application. So again, for visual design, you would want to think of color, contrast, and fonts. When it comes to a digital design, we're talking about descriptive images, proper formatting, and keyboard access. When we think about somebody who might have an auditory disability, again, somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, it's important that we look at the assistive technologies and make sure that, say our videos have captions associated with it, or if, we're doing something where there's, maybe it's like a kiosk element or something associated with it, that we have elements for people with hearing aids. So again, recommendations become about captions for audio content, writing in plain language, and videos that offer ASL. And I think you've seen it, especially within some of these daily briefings around COVID, rather than just relying on closed captioning elements, a lot of mayors or governors are leveraging actual interpreters just because of the degree of in terms of being able to really not just show the words, but also sort of the emotions associated with the words when describing something. So when we think about folks that might have a physical disability, again, we're talking about people who might not be able to use a mouse or a keyboard. Some of this assistive technologies associated with people who would have a physical disability is that they might use a trackball and mouse or a switch control, a sip and puff device, or just might use a voice control. In these moments, it's really critical that when you're designing your site, we want to make sure that the site is keyboard accessible, that there are proper tab controls and regions associated with it, and that there's labels associated with elements. And then finally, it's the concept around people who would have a cognitive disability. So anyone with a learning disability or developmental disability or cognitive or intellectual challenges. In those cases, they might uh, and this is where we would do checks internally, but you might want to use something like Grammarly or Hemingway Reader or a tool like Readability to ensure that your writing style is at a level where somebody with a cognitive disability had to, say, fill out a form. Those elements could be accessible for them. So again, our recommendations in that area are using clear and detailed instructions and using plain language when possible. Any questions at this point? Great. So, so when we think about solving these elements, most often you'll hear the term WCAG or the concept of WCAG 2.0 or the new standard 2.1, typically referred to as either AA or AAA. And so the W3C, basically in terms of helping create a global standard for creating accessible content, developed the Web Content Access Guideline. And in their process of creating the guidelines, essentially came up with a set of not only guidelines, but really 4 basic principles. And those principles are really sort of there as the goalpost to how we should think about accessibility within our applications. And the various use cases associated with it. Those are the principles are sort of described as poor, and so that is in the sense of not in that you're pouring knowledge into something. So POUR. So the first one is P for perceivable, O for operable, U for understandable, and R for robust. And we'll go through each one of those elements associated with it. Today, if you were building a site for a government agency, typically the standard is WCAG 2.0. So the first one at a AA standard. And if you go to the W3C and look up the WCAG guidelines, you'll see all the various guidelines associated with all the various standards. So when we look at the first one underneath principle 1, perceivable, what does that really mean? So when we think about perceivable, again, it's really for people with disabilities are able to perceive what's on your website. So when we think of that in terms of actual use cases, again, it's for folks who are blind, that there should be alternative text for images, right? So if I can't see that, my screen reader should be able to pick up on the alt text, and that alt text should be descriptive. If I'm deaf or hard of hearing, there should be captions, or even if I'm blind, there should be voiceovers associated with videos. And again, if I have a color blindness element, there should be significant color contrast between design elements and text. When we think of the WCAG principle 2, operable, this is really about will people with a disability be able to operate your website? And this quite simply is based on the fact of, if I do have a form on my website, is that form operable in a way where somebody with a disability or somebody who's using disability technologies can operate it? So if I have mobility issues, can I use keyboard access? If I'm blind, can I use a screen reader? Are all the fields associated, with that form? Do they have text labels and descriptive labels associated with it so that I can navigate that form in the same way as somebody who is sighted? The third principle is really around the idea of making everything understandable. So not only should something be able to be operated, but just as anybody, if I fill out a form wrong, can I understand exactly where I've made a mistake within that form? Are the error instructions um, valuable for me to understanding how to fix that error, and what are the methods that I have so that when I do correct the mistake, that I do understand that I have a proper success criteria. So when we think about understandable, again, will a person with a disability be able to understand what they're doing on the website? So are instructions clear? Is there text labels associated with all of those elements, and is there proper validation? Um, and the final element is really this concept of robust. And robust is really sort of, I think, overarching concept and principle that really says no matter where you're building this application, that it needs to be accessible in all of its various forms and permutations. So it's not just acceptable to say, well, on a Mac, in Safari, on a desktop, that's the acceptable, or the accessible place for, someone to use it, but it's really in all the various forms and permutations. So will your content preserve its accessibility across all different devices? Is it compatible against all operating systems or browsers? Even to some extent, between the various technologies that people are using with assistive technology. So if somebody's using NVDA or JAWS or an Apple product, is your application accessible across all three of those standards? If you're using standard HTML5, will it work and meet accessibility standards? If you're building any sort of custom elements associated with it or JavaScript, are you using the proper ARIA labels associated with each one of those standards? And so if we start to think about each one of these four principles, you really start to see how it envelops the entire application lifecycle in terms of meeting accessibility. I would want to point out one thing here, which is that just because you sort of, quote, check the boxes relative to all the guidelines associated with the WCAG standard, or think that you've made the WCAG 2.0 standard or AA, I do think that it's really critical that you do some form of usability testing. Because as I said earlier, while the ADA is very specific to say that applications today fall underneath the concept of Title III for public accommodation, just because you build to a standard of WCAG compliancy for 2.0 or 2.1 AA doesn't necessarily mean that you've met the guidelines associated with Title III. It really is based on this pure concept of, can somebody with a disability find it and deem it accessible to their own individualized standards? So there's some nuance there within the law, but it's really important to, when you're thinking about building for accessibility, understand that, while WCAG is a tool to solve for accessibility issues and to solve for Title III accommodation, it's not necessarily the standard. Anton, I would say again, is if there are any questions, now would be a good time to open it up. Okay, we're saving them for the end. Just a quick understanding. So again, I pointed this out, as I said, most companies still are observing the concept of WCAG 2.0 standard. There has been an update in 2018 to the WCAG standard called the WCAG 2.1, which really cover three criteria. One, folks with low vision accessibility, so the ability to zoom in, lettering, and word spacing. There have been some more test cases around cognitive accessibility. And then finally, the third one, which is probably the most important one, is that there's been updates and standards around mobile accessibility. So if you're not familiar with 2.1, I would highly recommend that you go through and take a look at it. When we think about the concept of accessibility and building it into your normal development practices or use cases, I wanted to go through a couple different scenarios for everyone in today's session, just so you have some key takeaways in terms of when you're coming to a crossroads of how to think about stuff. So again, when we're thinking about visual accessibility, it's the idea of color contrast. You want to make sure that the color contrast meets the standards for low vision and can be distinguished between various colors. There's a great tool by WebAIM, and that'll be in the slides that I send out later on that you can use if you need a good web color contrast checker. I think WebAIM has a great one. If you're building, again, carousels or slideshows, the idea is to give users start, pause, and skip functionalities and not just have something on autoplay. I think if you think or go and navigate to some websites, so many sites have maybe some sort of like image rotator or something that's on autoplay. And again, if you're navigating a website and you have a visual disability, that repeat sometimes become endless loops for people that are using screen readers, and something very difficult to navigate away from. So making sure that users have proper controls around carousels or slideshow become very key. Color usage, again, do not use color alone to distinguish elements such as a link or instruction. Combine color with a shape or pattern such as an asterisk or a warning icon to signify meaning or get users' attention. When we talk about fonts, again, it's the element of using sans serif fonts with a minimal font size of between 12 and 14 points for digital, 18 points or larger for print, and then, slide decks like today, a minimum of 24. When we talk about formatting for accessibility, again, if you look at your page design, it's really about understanding and making sure that you have alt text for images, that there's proper heading tags associated with your page, that you're dividing your page into proper heading structures, and creating, where needed, tables, lists, and links that follow the proper guidelines. This is a big one, and people actually constantly sort of run into issues associated with images and really making sure that images have proper alternative text. So again, if you have an image on your site, images should have a corresponding alternate text. That alternate text should be should describe using text for audiences that are blind or have low vision or users with slow internet connections. If your system cannot provide alternative text, it's important to make sure that you have some sort of description associated with that image, like you see here on the bottom, next to the image, so somebody with a screen reader would be able to pick up on it. And then while most social media platforms and websites do, provide for this, again, it's important to, have some form of alternate text associated with it. When you're writing alternate text, what we've tried to do is try to essentially, when you're going through it, understand the who, what, where, when, why, and any other sort of brand personality elements associated with that image when you're writing it. So when it comes to who's in the image, is it somebody we know, is it a character? um, uh, Oftentimes some people want to leave out things like gender or race when describing people in images, and just as a visual person can see that within the image. Many people within the disabled community believe that it's equally important to have those types of descriptions within the image itself. So, if there's ethnicity elements or gender elements associated with people who are in an image, it's important to characterize that. What are people doing? What is the activity? Give meaningful instructions around whatever actions they're doing. Where is the image taking place? Is it something in history? Is it indoors or outdoors? Is location significant associated with that image? Again, when is that image? Is it daytime or nighttime? Is it at a specific place or event? So, like the Olympics or at a sporting event. You might want to also talk about why. So, why are we posting the image? What message or context does the image convey associated with it? And again, in some cases also, when some images add no meaning and they're just decorative images, maybe you might have like a line or a squiggle on a site, just as you would want to add alternative text. If it doesn't have meaning to the page, those types of images you might want to hide associated with it. But again, and if you're doing this in conjunction with not only just for a personal site, but a brand or a company that you're working for, you might want to carry over and create that brand voice associated with it.
Hey, Matthew, you've got just
Yes.
about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Awesome. So, either personally or somebody, when you think about it, think of these contexts, think of the context here when we describe images. And if somebody wants to sort of, I would say, take a few notes while this stuff is fresh in your head, look at this image and maybe try to create an alt text associated with it might be a good activity. So just coming to the end here, again, when you're talking about pages, making sure that you have proper heading structures. Heading structures are really critical, especially for people with visual disabilities. It's one of the key elements that they use to navigate a page and understand the context of the page. So somebody who's using a screen reader might navigate through the various headings to understand what that page is about and where the various elements are associated with it. So many pages today, even with SEO being super relevant, have multiple H1s on their page or have weird structures around H2 or H3s. Having good, clean heading structures is really critical. If you're using links, again, good examples of links and bad examples of links, making sure that you have description within your links and they're not just learn more or click here. When we talk about instructions, the instruction should really be, clear and precise and give meaning to what a user is supposed to be doing. When we think about using plain language, again, so, here's a good example of like a before and after. So the application must be completed by the applicant and received by the financial officer by June 1st versus we must receive your application by June 1st. Again, write for the reader, not for yourself. And I think what's really critical here is if you are doing some writing elements, there are great tools out there like Hemingway that can scan through your page and really give you a good understanding of the grade level that you're writing for, and how you might want to reassociate it to meet a broader audience and work for people who have cognitive disabilities. Again, when we're talking about content access for folks with disabilities, it's really important to, remember and leverage things within social media, and that you are using proper alternate text associated with it. And these are some various resources that you can start to use. So understanding the Web Content Access Guidelines from the W3C, WebAIM has some great tools associated with understanding accessibility and tools. Wave is a great open and free checker if you're looking to check your page. And obviously, as I said, Hemingway is excellent for understanding, language levels within your site. I want to leave with this final note, which is really the concept that accessibility is for everybody. If you've ever used zoom control on a web page, you're using accessible technology. If you've ever used Hey Google or Siri, those foundations are all built on accessibility. If we've ever adjusted the color contrast or brightness within a site, again, all of those elements are derived from accessibility. And so the key takeaway point for everybody is that, accessibility and building accessible applications is really for everyone. If there's anything, hopefully today was a good way of helping everyone create a good foundation for that. This is my name, Matthew Elefant, and here are my contact infos. I'm happy to take any questions now if there are anyone. So we have about 10 minutes left.
All right, Matthew. We do have a couple questions. If you go to the questions section in your app, you can expand that and you see
Oh, okay.
questions there. And you can either, my suggestion is you can click on a question, read it off to the audience so they know what was speaking. It's like a text app, so you might want to start from the bottom of the list.
Yeah, I don't see any.
All right, no problem. I can take care of that. Might have to just do this. There we go.
Okay.
They're coming your way.
I see them now. Yes.
It's a weird permission issue with the way they set the app up, but there you go. That's all of them. So we have some comments from Ralph, and we have a question from Justin.
Yeah. So from for Justin, the question is an organization safe to stay at AA? Again, I would really sort of put it into context and say, thank you. Again, most companies follow the guideline of AA, and while that is often recommended, it is really critical that I believe for companies, if they really want to meet true accessibility, that they do some form of usability testing. Thank you. Just because a form has, text labels associated with all the various fields, that doesn't mean necessarily that if a person, with a disability doesn't understand what the forms mean, that it is fully accessible. So you can meet the guidelines, but not necessarily hit the mark when it comes to accessibility. Ralph, for text accessibility, plain tests are also recommended. Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right. If anyone else in the audience has questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the questions as well. You should be able to do that. Otherwise, I think that's it. All right. So all these sessions today are being recorded. In case you missed anything as part of Matthew's talk, we'll be posting those afterwards to our YouTube channel. In addition to that, as Matthew said, he'll make his slides available and we'll share those as well.
That's great.
And if anyone has questions throughout the day or any questions about some of these sessions, feel free to drop in on the general open GoToMeeting or drop a line on the help desk channel in Slack, and we'll be able to help point you in the right direction to find the next talk that you're looking for.
Thanks so much, Anton. This has been great, and I really appreciate it's broken up my my COVID quarantine day here to virtually be in Philadelphia with you all. So again, my name is Matthew Elefant. Please don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any private questions. I'm happy to answer stuff from you all.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Anton.